Great. Bore da pawb, croeso. It's great to welcome you all to this final Beyond the Mic session for Wales Climate Week, focusing on land and agriculture. My name's Sophie Wynne Jones, and I'm your chair for this session. I'm a senior lecturer in human geography at Bangor University, and my research focuses on land use governance and change, particularly the social and behavioural dimensions of the changes needed to address the climate crisis. I've worked for many years with farmers and land managers across Wales on exactly these issues, so it's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion today. Let me just set the scene a little bit before I introduce our panellists here. Why are we talking about land? As Dr. Rebecca Heaton outlined for us today in today's Talks for Tomorrow podcast, the way we use land is central to how we tackle climate change. There's huge potential for our land in Wales to sequester and to store carbon to enable us to meet net zero through our soils, including peatlands, and by managing and planting more trees and woodlands. Rural land management is also critical for adaptation to climate change, whether this is dealing with extremes of flooding or excessive temperatures. And this is something we need to respond to now, not in 2050. Yet agriculture in Wales is also a key source of emissions. So a major question for us this morning is how can we accelerate emissions reduction in this sector? But it's not all about climate, because we need to ensure that in taking these actions, we're also benefiting nature and supporting thriving rural communities, providing an integrated, multifunctional approach to land use. No easy challenge, I'm sure you'll agree. So to help us consider some ways forward, I'm joined by three excellent panellists. Firstly, we've got Tulare Fielden, who is the Policy Manager for the Farmers Union of Wales. And she's been very active in working with Welsh Government through the design of the Sustainable Farming Scheme to ensure it works for farmers so that they can deliver on these integrated objectives for land. She's also a first-generation tenant farmer herself, who has direct experience of the challenges farmers across Wales are grappling with. We've got Gary Newman, who is the Chief Executive of Wood Knowledge Wales, who are working to develop forest-based industries for increased prosperity and well-being in Wales. And this includes current projects to enhance the use of Welsh timber in low-carbon social housing, for example. Gary also spent some formative years as a researcher at the Biocomposite Centre in Bangor, which I have to mention because it's across the corridor from me now, where he became inspired by technical possibilities of biomaterials that offer novel solutions to our current challenges. And finally, Dr. Peter Jones, he's the Senior Specialist Advisor for Peatlands at Natural Resources Wales, where he leads on work to restore, protect and sustainably manage one of Wales's most vital carbon and biodiversity resources. Peter was awarded an MBE for services to the environment and recognising his long-standing contribution to peatland conservation and sustainable land management across Wales and beyond. So thank you for joining us today, speakers. Okay, I've given us a brief overview of some of the issues at hand, but I wanted to ask each of our panellists to give us a little bit more detail to set the scene. So if I could ask you in turn, what do you see as the key challenges and opportunities for decarbonising the land and agriculture sector in Wales? So Tulare, from the perspective of farmers, what are the key challenges and opportunities here for emissions reduction?
Thanks, Sophie. Okay, I'll start with glass half full, the opportunities. I actually think, and I'm sure we'll come to this later on, but I actually think adaptation is a real opportunity for farms. It's something, it's not so further down in the future. It's something that we can work on that fits our systems. If you're looking at deeper rooting, you're looking at shade and shelter, you're thinking about genetics, soil, etc. They're things that are very real and that we can see the sort of the feedback loop comes that little bit quicker. So I do think adaptation is actually a real opportunity for farmers. And I think, like you touched on at the beginning, that recognition of the sort of land sharing approach that the Welsh Government are taking, that, yes, land has got a lot of demands, but actually farmers are really well placed to deliver on all those as well and combine that. So I think that is a real opportunity, and the SFS is definitely part of that. In terms of the challenges, I think the complexity in the mixed messaging is really quite hard. Farming is a system that you're not just talking about carbon, you're talking about 3 different greenhouse gas emissions, and they work against each other, and you can do a lot of work in one and it makes absolutely no difference in the other or has a negative impact. And it's a whole other sort of language to learn in addition to sequestration and storage, etc. And we sort of combine that complexity with the sort of insecurity that we've got at the moment with budgets, with an election coming up, with trading system changing. So there's a lot of instability at the same time as complexity to understand. And I think that's a real barrier at the moment, to be honest.
Thanks, Larry. Great. There's quite a few things we can pick up there as we start to get into a bit more detail. Peter, I wanted to turn to you now. We know that peatlands are really important for both sequestering and storing carbon, but where are we up to with peatland restoration in Wales to maximise that potential, and how can we engage with land managers with this critical work?
Great diolch, Sophie and Borodar, pawb. Thank you for the question. Well, we're just coming to the end of the first 5 years of the National Peatland Action Programme in Wales, which is funded by Welsh Government and operated by Coedwigoedd Naturiol Cymru, together with a wide range of partners who receive funding from us. And so far, this has placed over 3,500 hectares of peatland on a recovery pathway. And then the kind of topical news is that just at the moment we're expanding the programme with the aim of delivering around 1,800 hectares of restoration each year by the end of the decade. Clearly critical to that target is our ability to engage with a much wider range of land managers to achieve this, ranging from an expanded range of organisations, which extends beyond the bodies you might expect to be involved in this work, to, of course, individuals. And just at the moment, we're working hard to put in place the tools for achieving this. And this coming Friday, on the 7th, we have a webinar event, and it's very easily accessed. Simply type Wales Peatland Action in your Google search engine. It'll bring up the National Peatland Action Programme on the NRW website. From that page, you'll find a link to grants, etc. And the purpose of that webinar is to introduce potential applicants to our latest range of peatland restoration grant funding. I think it's critical I emphasise the fundamental role and expertise of farming land managers in managing the land, and in particular grazing on peatlands. And pretty much all of our, or an awful lot of our restoration effort takes place within the context of agricultural units. And as we expand this energetic programme of peatland restoration to begin dealing with our most heavily modified peatlands, we will be reaching out very proactively and openly to this sector to kind of understand where are the opportunities for achieving greenhouse gas reductions on intensively managed peatland, for example, and what, as a national programme, do we need to put in place to actually help that happen?
Great. Okay, some good synergies there. An important role for farmers with managing peatlands. Thank you for that, Peter. Gary, there's been a lot of focus on tree planting as a critical measure to tackle climate change, but can we also be doing more to nurture the forestry sector across Wales? Is that a key thing to be thinking about as we're looking at this wider challenge of net zero?
Yeah, I mean, Borodar, good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. There's been a lot of focus on tree planting, that's for sure, which is kind of understandable, as there's IPCC targets and Welsh Government or IPCC recommendations and Welsh Government targets. Bit less focus on how to actually do it, or what the economic benefits are to the growers and to Welsh society. So we do need to increase the focus on the sector as a whole, from nursery all the way through to end use and beyond first use. I think most people grasp the benefit of trees to net zero. Most people love trees, in my experience. In fact, I've never met anybody who doesn't like trees. But relatively fewer people grasp the potential of timber to support the decarbonisation of the built environment, which I think needs to shift dramatically, and is starting to shift across the world, not just here in Wales. When we build a house today, 90% of the carbon emissions of that house over a 60-year life are emitted before anybody moves in. basically in the process of creating the home. So it's critical that we decarbonise the creation of buildings, and wood is fantastic for that. It creates a carbon store, and it's a low carbon material in the first place. So, but also in Wales, we have a great foundation for expansion. If you drive the Welsh borders, you'll see wagons with timber on, you'll pass sawmills, you'll pass factories, timber framers. It's kind of easy to forget, actually, that we've got this fantastic foundation of an industry that we can grow. You know, the really exciting part of it all for Wood Knowledge Wales, and I think for Wales, is that Welsh Government now has a timber industrial strategy, which was launched at the Royal Welsh Show earlier this year. So timber is now being seen as an industrial material. And I think steel has always been understood in that way, but timber has been somewhat taken for granted. So that's brilliant. And also we have a social housing project that involves 24 social landlords. That's 14 local authorities, 10 or so housing associations working together under to create a common design for timber-based social housing from the Welsh Forest, which I think is super exciting. One area where we need to do so much better is explaining the financial benefits to landowners of growing trees as a crop. After years of the Common Agricultural Policy, with forestry, you know, not being included, I think in the UK we've come to see forestry and farming as oppositional land use options. But in reality, in my opinion, trees and forestry is farming, part of farming. It's a crop. And the Welsh landscape, land climate, gives us huge advantages when we grow timber commercially, because we can grow them fast, about 6 times faster than Austria. So I think, yes, we have a fantastic opportunity, and there's lots to do.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. I'm just noticing in the chat here that some people are not hearing me so well. So I hope we can resolve that. I think the speakers can hear me all right. So I'm going to continue, but do tell me if there are problems, everybody. Okay, so I wanted to get into some of these issues in a little bit more detail. That's really helpful, Gary, for helping us understand what the potential of the timber industry and how we can get more land managers on board with that. I wanted to pick up on this point about adaptation that Teleri mentioned. I think it's important for us to reflect on whether we can reduce our emissions whilst also building our resilience to climate change. It's not one or the other, they have to go hand in hand. But I wanted to think a little bit more about the barriers that might stand in our way and how we can remove them. So Teleri, you mentioned that farmers seem to be slightly more on board with adaptation than perhaps other elements of decarbonisation. Is this because they are experiencing a changing climate already on their farms? And could you tell us a little bit more about what are they doing on the farm to deal with this, to adapt? And how can we help them further with that? What do you think is needed?
I think this is pretty perfect timing. I mean, one of the farms we rent is completely underwater at the moment, and there's only so much you can do about that, to be honest. Yeah, I think definitely we're experiencing it firsthand, and it's not just weather. It's a lot to do with sort of pests and diseases now as well. So flute burdens, ticks, etc. A lot of that, those mild wet winters are really having an impact. I think what I was trying to say in terms of timescales is when we talk about climate change mitigation, it seems really far away, and it seems sometimes to someone else. So you're talking about planting trees that will actively sequester maximum amounts in 30, 50 years time. Whereas right now you're worrying about your farm, your business, your family. So I think adaptation, even though some of these are more maybe a 5-year time scale, so when you're looking at improving your soil organic matter, that's still fairly sort of long term. You're looking at improving sort of aeration, reducing compaction in the soil because of these wet winters we've had. Those deeper rooting species that I mentioned, whether that's putting in a multi-species ley or on semi-natural permanent pastures, you're having sort of longer rest periods to get those roots in. And genetics as well is something that we're so good at in Wales, and we can do even more with. You know, we're sort of one step ahead in terms of adaptation in Wales, because we do have livestock that often fit the landscape that we're in. You know, we're not sort of factory farms, we're not you know, big indoor horticulture, etc. We do have a produce that fits the landscape, but the shifting baselines is really hard at the moment. So something that you've trialed one year at your risk, at sort of risk of the finance and risk of the system of the farm, doesn't work the following year. You know, we had that really wet winter, and the following year we had a really, really, really bad drought. So something that you put in place one year isn't going to work the next. And it's not necessarily something that makes sense financially. You know, it was really interesting recently, some of the HDB figures came out for benchmarking the suckler cow herds, which is what we've got a lot of in Wales. And those that were feeding and fertilising the most were still the ones making the most profit. So at the moment, they're still not quite matching up with the finances and the sort of, I suppose, the trade signals that farmers are having as well. But I definitely think it's something that captures the imagination more, because it involves more farmer to farmer speak. It involves you going and seeing how it works somewhere else. And I think that's got a lot of potential. But it'll be very different for each farm. Farms that are far more mechanised will need different ones. Farms that are dog and stick on a hill will need different solutions. And the question, sorry, you asked about how that can also reduce emissions. It's slightly ironic. In some instances, they will. You know, if you improve production, efficiency, etc. For some of them, they will have massive wins, for example, for nature, for biodiversity. You're focusing on soil, shade, shelter, improving ecosystem resilience. Ironically, then sometimes your methane is going to get worse, because your animals aren't fattening as quick, or they don't have as high production efficiencies, but the nature side is really gaining. So this is what I was trying to say before with the trade-offs. There's a lot of mixed messaging there about what works for what system and for which greenhouse gas you are targeting, really.
Thanks, Larry. It's really difficult, isn't it? Yeah, and it's great to get that perspective on the farm. I'm really interested in this idea that adaptation is seen as more tangible and easier to get on board with. Some research that we've been doing in Bangor, I suppose, really kind of confirms those wider messages. We've been looking at surveying beef and sheep farmers across the UK, and one of the key things that they were coming back and saying to us is they don't understand, or they don't see the co-benefits of actions to decarbonise. Whereas, you know, what you're saying there is, if adaptation has more immediate and apparent benefits, that's something they want to get on board with. So I suppose that's maybe something we can look at going forwards, is making sure that those co-benefits of decarbonisation and, you know, kind of the benefits of adaptation are obvious if we want people to engage. Okay, let's look at peat a little bit more. How can our peatlands help us to adapt as well as mitigate climate change, Peter? And are there any case studies of where this has been working really well across Wales?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I mean, the two are very closely linked, and they kind of require the same fundamental approach of using peatland restoration as a nature-based solution to a whole range of.
I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, Peter's a little bit quiet now. Come closer to your laptop, Peter.
I shall try putting my headset.
Yeah,
better.
That's perfect. That's
okay,
perfect.
I'm awfully sorry about that. I'll start
That's
again.
Fine. Go
yeah,
again.
and the whole question of the role of peatlands in helping us with climate change mitigation and adaptation, they're very closely linked, and they require the same fundamental approach of using peatland restoration as a nature-based solution. So just thinking of adaptation for a minute, a really important aspect to this is the role of peatlands in good ecological condition, in conferring resilience to key things like fires, which release huge amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. One estimate suggests 5 tons of carbon per hectare, and cause significant associated degradation. So fire is a major triggering event in inducing peat erosion, and with resultant downstream water quality issues. Naturally, functioning peatlands, or at least peatlands that have been restored, are very much less likely to burn and more likely to act as fire breaks. And we saw this very graphically this year with the very large peat fire which occurred on the west side of the Ellenith near Clywyn, and a peatland that we'd restored as part of the National Peatland Action Programme, actually marked the point where the fire stopped. It was nice and wet and soggy, and it did a fantastic job. There was also another huge burn this year on Mynydd Llangattock in southeast Wales, and it is the case that peatlands that we've historically drained, particularly where they don't have enough grazing and carry a high fuel load, are a lot more likely to burn and release large amounts of carbon. And the reality is Wales is going to be receiving something like 15% less summer rainfall by 2050, maybe as much as a quarter less by the 2080s. So the argument for re-wetting peatlands that have been artificially drained sooner rather than later is strong, really, in order to help put them in that more resilient space, and obviously they then continue to be of value as a grazing resource, which they have been for very many centuries. I'll just finish a little bit, just to say that peatlands are, of course, our best land-based store of carbon. So in terms of mitigation, peatland restoration is very effective in achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and can also help smooth out and delay flood peaks and sustain base flows during the summer. And re-wetting drained peatlands offers a potential emissions reduction of around about 3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. And I think if we scale that up year on year, that benefit across large areas, they really become significant figures, and it kind of makes obvious sense.
Thank you, Peter. A key resource. You're reminding me of cycling across exactly those bogs in the Ellenith many years ago, in fact. Okay, Gary, what role can trees and woods play in adaptation, and who needs to get involved to make this happen? Because I know you have a very collaborative approach in wood knowledge.
Yeah. I have a very superficial answer to who needs to get involved, because I think it's everybody, it's society, as well as all the different silos in the industries and governments and academia and all that kind of stuff. It's an interesting one, isn't it, adaptation? I mean, I've spent 30 years in and around climate change, and we didn't really talk about adaptation because back in the early days we were going to defeat it, and now the reality of climate change is upon us, and we don't really know what's coming. Some areas of forestry and trees, I think, are quite clear where there's opportunities on farms, for example, in terms of shelter belts, because we're going to have rising temperatures and more storms and all that kind of stuff. There needs to be a lot of thought about what trees, because we're going to have higher winds as well, blow them over, and we're going to have fires, as Peter's already mentioned. So, but there's also urban trees, so to provide some shelter from the heat that we're going to be confronted with. And then there's flood mitigation opportunities, and which I know is not always planting trees on farmland. It's not always benefiting the farmer in terms of flood mitigation, but it might be there may be benefits downstream. So it's questions as to how the money flows, for example, is I think key in all of that. In terms of timber, I think and forestry and timber, I mean, forestry needs to change. Resilience is going to be the name of the game. There's a lot of talk about hardwoods, softwoods, biodiverse forest, amenity forest, production forest, harvesting methods. But, ultimately, really the most important thing is that the forest is still there in 50 and 100 years' time, because the pressures on them are going to be enormous. That's a challenge for the way we organise forestry, because it needs to be highly adaptive and reactive to changing circumstances, such as big events like storms, floods, fires. God, that all sounds apocalyptic, doesn't it? But that's the reality, that we need to change the way we think about these things, and I would say devolve decision making down to the operational level when you're talking large forests. Species diversity is going to be a huge thing, and Welsh Government are funding a new project on that we're partners with Forest Research, so that's quite exciting. So we're going to need a lot more species to create resilience in our forests, which has knock-on effects downstream to the processes and the ultimate economic value of the forest. And in terms of creating the built environment, I think one of the key things that we need to wake up to is that the UK is the second largest importer of timber in the world. Timber is going to be harder to get hold of. We're not going to be able to take it for granted in the way that we have been, and therefore producing much more of our own timber is kind of key in that strategy to be more resilient to what we kind of know is on its way.
Thanks, Gary. Lots of things to think about there. I like, yeah, the role of peatlands and trees really critical, and there are some positive win-wins there to get farmers and land managers on board, which I think is really, really important. But it's just making sure that is obvious to them. Okay, I wanted to turn now to look at the role of technology in our apocalyptic future that we're facing, Gary, that you outlined us there with our floods, and we need some technology as well, perhaps. How do we use technology, whether it's AI, remote sensing, or robotics, to accelerate the transition to net zero? Larry, is it something you see as helpful in the transition ahead for farmers? You mentioned the sort of the dog and stick farmer. Are they going to use technology? Can it make farmers' jobs easier, do you think?
It's yes and no. It's 100% got a role, and there's a lot of innovators that are out there using it right now. Robotics, AI, mapping systems, etc. That they're all happening now within farming. I think at the end of the day, farming is inherently a practical thing constrained by biological systems. So there's a certain amount of that can obviously be tapped into. And I think again, I'm going to come back to the thing. It totally depends on the system you've got. So again, your sort of upland sheep farming system, there's definitely, there's things to do with genetics, there's things to do with fertility, there's things to do with soil, etc., that can utilize some of these technologies. But actually, if your output at the end of the day isn't going to be hugely different, you've got to be careful about that input and the money and things that people are trying to sell you. The other thing, what I do think that we can do a lot better in Wales, and this is a bit of a challenge to Welsh Government, to be honest, is actually utilise tech and the data that farmers give far more efficiently. So there's an awful lot that's there already. All of us as farmers log into RPW online quite regularly throughout the year. All of our cattle have got passports. Welsh Government have got all of our numbers. They've got their calving rates. They've got their births, dates, etc. When we go out to fill our paperwork, the agricultural pollution regs are a great example, or carbon calculators are actually another really example. You've got to sit there with a really clunky spreadsheet and work out what numbers have you got in January, what age are they in January, what are your fertility, what are your sort of calving intervals, etc. You've got to colour in on your map where your risk is for water sources, and it's all there. The mapping's there, the LiDAR data, it's there, the map, So I think it's quite frustrating that, yes, there's opportunities to utilise tech more, but actually there's more opportunities to utilise what we already give and turn that into insights to farmers instead of another spreadsheet to fill out, another form to do, something that doesn't actually talk to your system. It's just another tick box. So, and obviously, inevitably, with the sort of, there's a huge range of technological ability within farming and within farmers and within our population. So you sort of making that fair for everyone, we've got to be really careful because people are being left behind as data moves on in rural areas as well.
Thanks, Larry. That's a really, really useful insights. And yes, I remember from working with Welsh Government on the sustainable farming scheme, how much concern there was at the start about the administrative load. And that was some really important feedback. I'm going to pick up on those kind of questions about dialogue and so on in just a moment. We don't run out of time. But I think that's some really useful insights about how we can make better use of data. Gary, with the forestry sector, are you excited about new technologies, or is it the diverse potential of timber itself as a material that you see as offering the greatest scope for future innovation to support net zero?
I think both. innovation is going on all the time. You know, from pre-nurseries all the way through to how we use wood. It's incredibly dynamic and rapidly evolving space. You know, in part because, you know, Scandinavian countries, you know, whose economies are entirely based on wood, are innovating furiously, and you know, and there's a lot going on in Wales too. I think thinking about what technology will enable, I think is probably more useful in this space that we've got. And I think the data that we can get now from forests will allow greater species diversity, which will help us increase resilience, because we'll have more data on more species, and we'll be able to track individual trees from forest to sawmill at some point. Not done at the moment, but that's likely to be coming. We can have more precise processing, enable us to get high yields from less material. We are also innovating furiously in the built environment, and I think timber is going to enable us to build faster, higher and better, creating sort of healthier buildings. We've got a terrible problem of mold and damp in built environment at the moment, which is it's a killer. And timber and timber products helps deal with some of the issues of mold. So there's a huge amount going on in the space, and I think in the next 30 years we're going to see an incredible transformation in not just, you know, the forest, but also in the conversion of the raw material into advanced timber products.
That's great. It's really, really exciting to think a little bit differently about how we can use our raw materials in Wales. Peter, we were talking about data just a minute ago with Teleri. I wanted to pick up on that in relation to the peatland side of things. How can this sort of advanced technology and use of data, how can that help with monitoring and measurement of carbon and biodiversity? And with your work with peatlands, how is that key for our transition to net zero?
Great, yeah, thanks for the question. Well, there's really topically, actually, Sophie, there's a big research community, including that based right next to you in Bangor, both in the university and in the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and that's focused on, among other things, learning how we understand and quantify greenhouse gas emissions from different peatland surfaces. And we, in the National Peatland Action Programme, we use that in a very applied way in directly targeting our programme and in quantifying its benefits, because our peat programme is all about restoring peatlands, both for nature and for climate, and thereby for the people of Wales. More practically, perhaps, we use a lot of remote sensing derived information in planning restoration. We use surface elevation information, for example, and in working out where water is moving on peatlands and what we need to do to make sure that water stays on the peatland surface. And some of our partners in Wales are looking at how the seasonal surface movement of peatlands, which can be detected by satellite, can help us home in on sites requiring restoration and quantify some of its benefits. So basically, a peatland that's got plenty of water in it and is in reasonably good condition does actually move up and down seasonally a bit, and that can be detected. A peatland that's damaged, drained, for example, or has lost a load of its peat, doesn't move so much. So that's a good example. And then I think that there's also the issue, the more practical, issue of fenceless grazing using stock collars, recognizing that peatlands are often quite challenging places to graze within the context of modern agricultural enterprises. And whilst they were often grazed 100 years ago or even less, many, particularly in the lowlands, are now grazed less so, and I think that's something we're very keen to promote. And then at kind of a more macro level, as a programme, we report into the national methodology for reporting changes in greenhouse gas emissions as part of national greenhouse gas accounting. And then I suppose finally, I think there is lots of potential, emerging potential, enabling individuals to go out there and map and understand their own peatlands. There's with the kind of mapping applications you can get even on a mobile phone now, people can actually go out and there are methodologies that you can use, or we can help develop, that would enable people to understand how much peat they've got, how much carbon they've got, because that's an important resource to understand.
Great. I like the idea of everybody having the opportunity to get out there and to get involved in keeping an eye on these critical habitats. Okay, I'm mindful of the time a little bit here, so I want to remind our audience that it's going to be your time for some questions just shortly. So do start thinking about those. We've got a few more things we're going to go through now, but start thinking about your questions. Some of you have put them in the chat already, so do get those questions start to flow in, but we'll have a specific slot for that. Okay, so one of the things that I'm hearing loud and clear is the importance of kind of flexibility for different landowners, that there isn't a one size fits all, and it's about kind of making sure that we're bringing producers and land managers on board so that they can see the benefits of the peatlands and the woodlands. How can we ensure that we have these participatory approaches, if we want to call them that, built into decision making? What do we think has worked well? I was really involved with the Welsh Government's Sustainable Farming Scheme co-design a couple of years back. I had the privilege of undertaking a fellowship so I could work with them directly. So I got some insights on how that works. So maybe that's one thing that we could reflect on. I know Larry has had some direct experience, but if there's other examples, Gary, for instance, you have a very collaborative approach to your work with Wood Knowledge Wales. How do you make that work to enable innovation and create change? How do you support that kind of participatory approach so that you're really getting the different stakeholder perspectives that we need?
Yeah, really, really good question. It goes to the heart of what Wood Knowledge Wales is about, really. And maybe I could start by saying, governments are really important in this. They select, they create the frameworks and the policies, but actually they don't typically do the doing. The doing is done by landowners, farmers, foresters, house builders, and so policy doesn't necessarily make anything happen. They can, and therefore I think and we're talking systems change, so we're talking the connections between the different disciplines, different silos, academia, industry, government, academia, all the different departments that typically work in silos. And when you're talking system change, it's the connections between those silos. But that's really easy to say, but it's hard to do because no money flows to making the connections between the silos. It all flows to a silo by almost definition. And that's why everybody coalesces around a particular discipline. I think our approach is to work from the bottom up, is to connect, to build confidence, to build understanding. And it's not really difficult, and it's just expensive and time consuming. And, governments typically will spend a lot on creating a policy, but maybe less so on how it's implemented and understanding how it's implemented and whether everybody's bought into the process of implementation and how we do it, capture the learning, share the knowledge, all of this stuff that's actually, I believe, is critical because you can't wish solutions, you can't policy drive solutions. And that takes time. And that also bothers me a little bit because we're always talking about needing to do things now. And, that's really difficult. And governments change. So the best way to protect ourselves against changing governments with changing ideas is to be as connected as possible in the foundations of the doing, so that actually people are making it happen themselves, either because it's the right thing to do or it's the most economically sensible thing to do. which I don't think we talk about enough, because climate change mitigation and adaptation is a fantastic commercial opportunity, as well as essential for our well-being and thriving.
Thanks, Gary. Really useful insights. Yes, how can we focus more on the implementation rather than just designing policy is a key question. So Larry, maybe picking up a little bit on that, what I was saying about the sustainable farming scheme there, that has involved a lot of dialogue. There's been a lot of conversation, a lot of listening going on. Are there any kind of key lessons you think going forwards from that in terms of how we ensure that participatory approach so that we have schemes that do work for this very diverse sector that you've been describing for us?
Yeah, I'm definitely greyer and more tired, isn't it? The result of it. It's been an awful lot of work. To be fair to the Deputy First Minister, I think the most recent, we've moved on so much more in the last year and a half than we did in sort of 8 years. So the process, he put everyone in the same room. I'm not saying that was an easy process to go through, and it took many hours and many meetings. And no one's happy. No one's exactly, it's not the scheme that any of us individually chose. But to be fair, because the SFS is trying to do so many different things for so many different objectives, it was always going to be A, needed, and B, the challenge of it. So I think that did help, and we all had the opportunity to literally thrash out, go through things line by line, put forward what we wanted. I do think the only thing we got to is, in terms of our members and in terms of farmers, there was kind of consultation weariness. I feel like that there was, however many consultations we had, people didn't always felt that they were being listened to. The protests really showed that. When we had the biggest protest in the Senate, it really showed that sort of strength, the feeling that it had created. It's not perfect, but I think Gary's hit on it in terms of an evolution. So the important thing now is, no, it's not perfect. It's very clunky, but get it on the ground, get things working, do it step by step. Ideally, we'd have liked to have seen more of a sort of an ease of transition into it instead of the drop in BPS funding, which means that a lot of people are going to have to go in before they've really got their head around it all as well. And I think as well, the sort of what is easier sometimes for government to do is do it as regulation, or do it as advice and guidance, or do it as a capital grant. Whereas hopefully what we've got with the SFS is we've got the social value payment, which does, in theory, reflect those wider benefits that farming is creating. Because otherwise what we do see a lot of is the money and the sort of the effort going into creating a regulation, creating a do not. Basically it ends up being just a do not, which doesn't bring anyone along with you. Or it's easier for them to spend the money on advisors or on admin or on mapping, whereas so then the money that actually gets to the farmer or the land manager doing it or managing it is a sort of 40% contribution. You've got to cash flow it, you've got to do the labour, you've got to plan it, and then you get a bit of money at the end. Thank you very much. So I think there's a lot more. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but I think there's a lot more that we can improve on in the SFS. But Gary's totally right. We need to try it out, see what works, and make sure that the Welsh Government, whoever they will be, will keep listening and keep everyone in the room, I think.
Great, thank you, Larry. Yeah, important to think about how do we get that money to farmers to make sure they can implement these changes is an important consideration. Peter, have you got any good examples of how a kind of a participatory approach can work well with peatland restoration?
Yeah, absolutely. So when really throughout the last 5 years of the programme, we've put a lot of emphasis into engaging with, with all key sectors, ensuring, strong representation at things like the Royal Welsh Agricultural Show, for example. And, it's very important we recognise and articulate that the vast majority of Welsh peatlands are farmed, generally for grazing. And there is accordingly a huge amount of expertise and wisdom in how best to graze these places to achieve particular biodiversity outcomes. And I think it's very important that we remain, very cognizant of that in discussing and funding future management. And I think participation is important for identifying solutions to problems. An example of a project funded by the old SMS scheme up on the Midnight springs very much to mind, where a group of local farmers came together to look at how cattle grazing could be made to work on blanket bog, and then also working at catchment scales, because often it's action focused at a catchment scale that will have the biggest downstream beneficial impacts. And then there's an absolutely huge role for it in identifying how we begin to tackle reducing greenhouse gas emissions from some of our most heavily modified peatlands in Wales. These are often under really quite intensive agricultural management, and it's very important that we learn from experience elsewhere. There's been a lot of effort in England and continental Europe devoted to this. It can only be progressed collaboratively through respectful and meaningful dialogue with the people whose land it is. And really, whilst we were still a relatively small programme, we were, making sure we kept in touch with the Wales Land Management Forum. But as we go forward, we're going to need more sort of focused discussion with individuals and groups of individuals to really progress that work.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to see that things can work and have been working well in some examples. But it's good to hear about those case studies. Actually, to the audience, if you've got case studies of where you think things are working well, please do put those in the chat. I can see a few questions coming through, but I definitely want to make sure we've got time for this now, because we've got 15 minutes. If I'm not getting lots of questions coming through from the audience, I have a few more things that I can definitely pick up on. There's some points in the chat about the carbon footprinting of game bird rearing and the effects of game birds on biodiversity. I'm not sure if this is a field we've got expertise on here. Particularly a question around the condition of our river SACs and how we can manage them. Not necessarily a kind of a carbon specific question, but certainly one about land management in broader terms. So I don't know if any of our panelists want to pick up on thinking about this kind of wider habitat management, the river habitats. How do we develop accountable plans there? Seems like a kind of a key tangible question. Any thoughts on the management of our key rivers? I know the why, there's been a lot of controversy around that, but we've got some really important river catchments. Peter, I can see you nodding, but Hilaria, is that something you wanted to pick up on at all? How can we have an accountable plan with outcomes, metrics, and timelines for the management of our river SACs?
I mean, I don't know if you want me to kick off with that. I'm not at all involved with that area of work, but the kind of knowledge I do have surrounds the kind of wider the significance of wider catchment management, and particularly the role that peatlands can play in regulating downstream water quality. So I think that's an important focal area there. And we have a Y, an upper Y catchment project running, which is looking at other catchment issues. And of course, I think SFS has a huge role Sustainable Farming Scheme, has a huge role to play here. But as I say, I'm not specifically briefed in detail on that. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's useful to think about that kind of wider catchment management, because we're looking at what ends up in our rivers. It is about that kind of bigger picture, and thinking about the upstream, thinking about those uplands, and kind of how we can incentivize land managers and work effectively with land managers to take care of those downstream environments. Hilaria, did you want to add anything on that question?
Yeah, again, by no means a river expert, not my sort of specialty. But I would say, obviously we've got more recently the Control of Agriculture Pollution regulations that come in, and that is very much Welsh Government driven. And instead of, because at one point it was going to be on advice to sort of 8% of Wales, but now it is the entirety of Wales that is effectively an MVZ zone. So there will be reviews of that. And it is a lot of extra work for farmers. It's a lot of extra paperwork, to be honest, as well. And it involves nutrient management plans. It involves restrictions on slurry. It involves a lot of extra concrete and steel, to be totally honest. It's been a big cost for the industry as well. And I think exactly as Pete said, that the SFS will be part of this as well, with those sort of expectations of farmers. But obviously the SFS is voluntary. It doesn't mean that those farmers necessarily go into it. And this is where I think actually the supermarkets buying the products have got quite a responsibility in this as well. You know, it's not just that catchment that is eating that food. The food and those nutrients are going elsewhere. So it's a bigger, it's one of those answers, sorry, where we end up tying in lots and lots of different issues, and it does link in the food system as well.
Great, thank you. And Andy Schofield in the chat there sort of saying, you know, yeah, surely we shouldn't have to incentivize land managers, but yeah, you're responding there to Larry saying it's not necessarily about, you know, there are issues with regulation, things that we hadn't thought about, and there is other actors to bring into that. So there's always a balance of, you know, what's the most effective mechanism, and yeah, can we bring the supermarkets with us? It's really important. Okay, I'm not getting any more specific questions. There's lots of kind of chat discussions. If anyone's got any key questions, put them in the chat. I will put them across to our speakers. I'm just going to have one more. We've got 10 minutes now. Got one more kind of tiny question to finish us off. I'm sort of thinking about the kind of future outlook here and our kind of visions for the future. If each of my speakers could just give me one thing that you kind of think, what do you think is preventing the transitions that we want? You know, what would you like to see? What if you could ask for one thing to take away that you would like to see to kind of enable that shift to the future? Give me a 1 minute answer each. You know, is that about innovation and skills support? Is that you know, kind of data? Is that about more deliberation and participatory forums? What do you think we need to take us forward on this journey? Could I get a response from each of you in turn? Who should we start with? Gary.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. One thing, I'm a bottom-up kind of guy. I like I like it that it's not about regulation, it's about people doing the delivery. Having said that, I don't think we can afford to be super inefficient about what we do, whether that's biodiversity protection, food production. And I would like to see more thought given to what's the optimal solution in which part of Wales. You know, amenity forestry lends itself to being in places where there are trees, where there are lots of people. Productive forestry, maybe where there are fewer people. That kind of thing. We don't have a land use strategy. I don't want a land use strategy to tell everybody what to do, but I think a sense as to what the optimal answers might look like, and maybe incentivize that in some way, would reduce the inefficiencies of what we're doing, which I don't think are sensible in a resource constrained world.
Thanks, Gary. That's a great answer. I'm a geographer, so thinking about place and variation across our country is so important. And it's difficult for policy, isn't it? It isn't a one-size-fits-all. We saw that as a major issue with the sustainable farming scheme, and we've made changes accordingly. But yeah, designing things that fit our varied landscapes is really challenging. So thank you for bringing that up. Larry, what would be your one priority to take us forward on this journey?
Really hard to choose one.
Yeah, I know.
Really hard. I suppose going back to what I was saying before about sort of the clarity of what this looks like for the specific business, person, etc., and clarity on how we can move forward with it, because a lot of the time I think climate change discussions within farming, they end up in the list of do not, and they end up in a list of sort of what you can't do, which might be, you know, that you reduce your livestock, or that, sorry, Gary, in some cases that trees go instead, then you're not farming. So it's a not instead of a doing. Whereas actually, I think if we've got clarity on how these things can fit together and how they can fit into a business and how they are beneficial, not a do not, I think that would help move it forward, instead of us sort of feeling like we have to constantly just be on the defense, which is quite tiring.
Thanks, Larry. I think that's really, yeah, as somebody who kind of works in that kind of behavioural space, I completely agree. You know, constantly telling people they're doing a bad job, don't do this, don't do that. You know, I've seen so many problems over the years of farmers feeling like they're kind of being criticised constantly, that they're not good farmers, and that just that's not nice, is it? No one wants to be told So yes, and I think across the board, that sense of, for all of us, not just land managers and farmers, but for all of us, what do we do? I think is a really proactive message. I like that. Thank you.
Sophie, could I just add one more thing?
I'm not sure. It's got to be very quick, very quick.
Allow farmers to plant trees and then take them away if they decide they don't want them. At the moment, if you convert to trees, you have to leave them as trees. And I think that's a massive barrier and it doesn't make sense. And it speaks to what Taleri's talking about, which is, allow farmers to do more of what makes sense for them at any given moment.
Excellent. That's a really good point. Yes. Once you don't want to feel like you've made an irreversible decision, you need that flexibility. I like it. Okay, Peter, your one wish to take us forwards.
Yeah, well, there's a sort of introduction to the one wish, if that's all right, which is, I think it's really important we recognise the very specific benefits which semi-natural peatlands offer relative to other land cover types on peat, remembering this is only 4% of Wales. So, and we think we need to restore around 45,000 hectares of peatland by 2050 to attain the peatland contribution to net zero. So I think the really important thing is around ensuring that the protection and sustainable management of peatlands is enabled through alignment of all policy and delivery mechanisms. It's got to be integrated. And in very practical terms, we want to increase the buy-in of our community in restoring peatlands. We need more contractors, and we need to broaden the range of people who can actually engage in that work.
Great, thank you, Peter. Yes, integrated planning sounds like it's an important thing there. Okay, brilliant. I'm just looking to see if anybody's putting any other questions in the chat. There's some people talking about horticulture, which is something I should probably flag too, because I'm involved with the local policy innovation partnership for rural Wales, where we've been looking at some innovations to try and stimulate and support kind of horticulture that can address net zero and support us with net zero. So yes, we've been talking a lot about red meat and grazing today, but yes, land use is much wider. So there are other aspects that we need to think about there. And the greater role for non-native conifers, I think, is something, Gary, you've kind of flagged that the importance of diverse species is really important. So thank you for all of your comments in the chat and your different questions there, folks. I'm just going to kind of wrap up with a couple of key points to sort of take away. I really liked Larry's message about what can we do, the positives. I think that's really critical, isn't it? There has been a lot of contention in this space around land use change, around the sustainable farming scheme, and I think it's a really positive thing that we have been able to kind of come together and try and reach some kind of agreement. We're not all super happy, but we're happy to move forward and see where we get to, and I think that's what we need to do. And having those respectful conversations and not criticising each other, I think, is really challenging. There's a lot of difficult decisions to make here, and seeing what it looks like on the ground and getting people to talk to each other. I like Gary's bottom-up conversations, making the time for that, seeing how it works in terms of implementation, and then adapt and change. And maybe if you've done something that hasn't worked, then maybe we need to shift that over. The importance of co-benefits seems really critical there. Again, there's something that we've been working a lot on in Bangor. Some of the LPIP research that we're doing right now is trying to really unpick those co-benefits a little bit more. And that seems critical to achieving multifunctional landscapes across Wales. And we do have such a diverse and such a rich landscape across Wales. So I think thinking about that geography and thinking about what suits people in place seems to be a really critical part of that. So making sure that all of the different individuals and the different stakeholders are engaged and on board with that seems to be a really critical element going forwards. Making sure we're supporting each other, working together in our communities, working with land managers, supporting producers, buying local produce, investing in nature, investing in climate. I think these are all things that we can do to move forward and look for those win-wins. There's lots of things we can argue about, and we can spend a lot of time arguing about things, but I think there's a lot of win-wins that maybe we can focus on a little bit more. So. And just reinforcing that, thinking from a behavioural perspective, thinking from sort of a social system change, trying to find those positive synergies is really critical. So, and I think we've got a lot of that. Rebecca Heaton said in her podcast, you know, she's like, we've got this in Wales, we can do this, we've got the skills, we've got the experience, we've got the capacity, and I think if we pull together, I feel quite positive that we can try to do those things, even when our farms are underwater, as Terry sounds like it currently is at the moment. But yes, I hope you're all keeping safe out there in this crazy weather that we've got. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. It's been great to speak with you all. There's many more things we could have talked about, but please, I'm sure, you know, kind of continue the conversation on social media. It's